The courtroom doors opened at 9:17 in the morning, and two people walked through them that nobody in Gull Harbor expected to see together. A young man in a gray suit that still had the crease marks from the store, and a woman with tired eyes and a reporter's notebook clutched so tight her knuckles had gone pale. They didn't take seats in the gallery. They walked straight past the rows of watching neighbors, straight past the bailiff who half reached for his radio, and sat down at the defense table beside a woman in a county jumpsuit who had not looked up from her hands in 11 minutes. The prosecutor leaned toward his assistant and murmured something nobody quite caught. But everyone in that room understood the shape of the question even without hearing it. Who are these two, and why does the defendant's whole body change when they sit down beside her? The answer to that question went back 20 years, to a rainy Tuesday night and a diner that stayed open too late, and a decision one woman made that this town never fully forgave her for, and never fully understood either. Marisol Reyes was 31 years old the year everything started, and she was already tired in the particular way that comes from running a business alone. She owned the Blue Anchor, a narrow diner 2 blocks off the harbor in Gull Harbor, Oregon, with red vinyl booths that had gone the color of dried rust and a coffee machine that groaned like it resented every order. She had inherited the place from her father, Ernesto Reyes, who had come up from Jalisco 40 years earlier and built the diner out of a defunct bait shop with his own hands. Marisol had married young to a fisherman named Dale Kessler, who went out on the boats for the crab season every winter, and for 6 years the two of them had a life that felt, if not easy, at least whole. Then a rogue wave took the Pacific Dawn 11 miles offshore, and Dale never came home, and Marisol buried an empty casket beside her father's grave and went back to flipping eggs the following Monday, because the diner didn't run itself and grief didn't pay the propane bill. They never had children, she and Dale. It was one of those quiet griefs she carried, folded up small, tucked behind the bigger grief of losing him, and she rarely let herself unfold it. The diner became the shape of her days. Open at 5, close at 9, sleep above the kitchen in the little apartment her father had built, wake up and do it again. People in town knew her name, knew her coffee, knew the particular way she called out orders in a mix of English and Spanish that nobody bothered translating because everyone had learned it by heart. But nobody really knew her anymore, not since Dale. That was the shape of Marisol's life on a wet October evening, when the diner was down to its last 2 customers, and she was wiping the counter for the 3rd time, just to have something to do with her hands. That was when she saw them through the window. 2 children standing under the diner's awning, not moving, rain coming down in sheets behind them. A boy who looked about 8, and a smaller girl beside him, maybe 5, her hand fisted so tightly in the sleeve of the boy's jacket that her knuckles had gone white even in the dim light. Both of them were white, both soaked through, and neither of them was crying. The boy had his arm braced across his sister's shoulders in a way that looked practiced, like a gesture he had made 100 times before and knew exactly how to hold. Marisol wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. "You two need to come inside," she said. "You're going to freeze out here." The boy looked up at her with eyes the color of wet slate. "We're waiting for our uncle. He said to wait right here." "How long ago did he say that?" The boy glanced at the sky, calculating something he didn't want to say out loud. "This afternoon." It was nearly 8 o'clock. She brought them in anyway, sat them in the corner booth, and made them hot chocolate even though the kitchen was technically closed. The girl wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world and didn't say a single word. Marisol learned the rest slowly. In pieces the boy offered reluctantly, the way you hand over things you've been told to protect. Their mother had overdosed 6 weeks earlier. Their father had left before the girl was born, and nobody had heard from him since. An uncle on their mother's side had taken them in, temporarily, though temporary had apparently come to mean whatever he wanted it to mean, including leaving two children outside a diner in the rain and driving off. Marisol called the sheriff's department. Two deputies came, and the moment they stepped through the door and saw a Mexican-American woman standing protectively between them and two blonde, blue-eyed children, their whole posture shifted, hands drifting toward their belts, before either of them had asked a single question. "Ma'am, what's your relationship to these kids?" she explained. She explained again, more slowly, and a third time, because the deputies kept looking at her like she was a math problem that refused to balance. She was just a woman who owned a diner, just a stranger who happened to be open when nobody else was. But she understood, standing there in her apron with flour still on her hands, that some people would always see her the way they wanted to see her before they ever bothered to listen. Before the deputies took the children out to the cruiser, the little girl turned around and looked back through the diner window at Marisol. One of the deputies bent down and asked if the woman had done anything to frighten her. The girl shook her head hard enough to send her wet hair swinging and said, in a voice so small it barely carried, "She gave us hot chocolate." It was the first full sentence she had spoken since they'd been standing under that awning. 2 months passed. Marisol went back to the diner, back to the routine, 5 in the morning to 9 at night. But something had shifted underneath the surface of her days. She kept thinking about the boy's arm around his sister's shoulders. She kept thinking about the girl's voice through the glass. She told herself it wasn't her business, that the county had systems for this, that those children belonged to a machinery bigger than a diner owner with an empty house above a kitchen. Then she heard, through a church friend who worked in the clerk's office, that the boy and girl had already cycled through 3 foster placements in 2 months. Nobody wanted to take both of them, and the boy would not be separated from his sister. Every time a family tried to take just one, he shut down completely. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, planted himself by the front door and refused to move, so they kept getting sent back, and the file kept getting thicker, and the two of them kept getting shuffled around like nobody had ever really wanted either one. Marisol filed the paperwork on a Thursday morning before the breakfast rush. The reactions came fast, and they came from every direction at once. The caseworker assigned to her file, a brisk woman named Patricia Yoder, studied her over the top of a manila folder with an expression trying very hard to be professional and failing at it. "Ms. Reyes, you understand these children are? Well, they're not." She glanced at the folder as if the right word might be hiding somewhere inside it. "You understand what I mean?" "I understand exactly what you mean," Marisol said. "I'd like you to say it anyway." Patricia Yoder didn't say it. She ordered 3 home inspections instead of the standard one, and asked questions about Marisol's finances that no married white couple in that county had ever been asked. The family court judge scheduled a psychological evaluation that wasn't required by statute, but that nobody at the courthouse seemed willing to waive. Even people in Marisol's own life pulled back. Her cousin Teresa, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, took her aside after Mass. "Mari, you're inviting trouble. A single woman, on her own, raising 2 white kids in this town. People are going to talk, and not the good kind of talk. They're already talking," Marisol said. "At least this way they'll have something true to say." It took 7 months. 7 months of interviews and home visits and background checks that dug into corners of her life that had nothing to do with her ability to raise a child. But on a gray morning in May, a judge signed the papers, and Marisol Reyes became the legal mother of Sawyer and Ren Kessler. She gave them Dale's last name, not her own, because she thought they deserved to belong to a family that had wanted children even before it had them, and Dale had always wanted children. The first night, Marisol set up the spare room with 2 beds pushed close together, because Sawyer refused to sleep if he couldn't see his sister, and a nightlight shaped like a lighthouse she'd found at the hardware store. Wren fell asleep within minutes, the deep, boneless sleep of a child who finally believed, at least for one night, that nothing was going to happen to her while she wasn't looking. Sawyer lay rigid on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling. Marisol checked on them before turning in, stood in the doorway a long moment, and his eyes found hers in the dark. "Are you going to leave too?" His voice was flat, not frightened, just factual, like he was asking about the weather. She didn't answer with words. She pulled the chair in from the hallway, set it beside his bed, and sat down. She stayed there the whole night. When Sawyer woke the next morning, she was still in that chair, head tipped back, asleep but present. And something in his gray eyes shifted. Just barely, like a door that had been bolted shut for a long time, creaking open half an inch. The years that followed were not easy, and they were never going to be easy. A Mexican-American woman raising two white children alone in a fishing town where most of the old families had known each other for 4 generations. That was a fact that made people uncomfortable in ways they rarely said out loud, but always managed to communicate anyway. The first day of school set the tone for a lot of what followed. Marisol walked Sawyer and Wren through the doors of Gull Harbor Elementary, holding a hand each. The front office secretary smiled warmly at the children, then looked up at Marisol and asked, not unkindly, just carelessly, "And you're the nanny, is that right?" "I'm their mother," Marisol said. The secretary's smile didn't disappear so much as rearrange itself into something confused, apologetic, and unconvinced all at once. The particular expression of someone encountering a fact her mind hadn't been built to file correctly. A mother in the sign-in line pulled her own son a half step closer, an instinct so automatic she likely never noticed she'd done it. That afternoon, Sawyer came home and sat at the kitchen table without touching his snack. "Mom, why does everyone look at us funny?" Marisol sat down across from him so their eyes were level. "Because they haven't seen a family like ours before. That doesn't make it wrong, Mijo. It just means we're first." There were harder moments than that one. When Wren was 9 and Sawyer was 11, Marisol attended a parent-teacher night she'd had circled on the calendar for 2 weeks. She wore her good blouse, the one she saved for mass and funerals, and brought a folder with both kids' report cards because she had learned by then that a Latina mother in a mostly white school district needed receipts. Nobody asked white mothers to carry. A woman named Diane Calloway, whose husband owned half the waterfront and whose name sat on the plaque above the school gymnasium door, stood during the open comment portion of the meeting. "I only ask this out of concern for the children," Diane Calloway said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Has anyone actually verified that a woman on her own, with no family support in this community, running a business 7 days a week is really an appropriate placement for 2 children who are?" She paused delicately, "not her own." The room went very quiet. Marisol felt every eye swing toward her. She could have walked out. Instead, she stood, opened her folder, and laid the report cards flat on the table in front of her. Straight A's, both of them, term after term, along with notes from the school counselor, praising Wren's kindness and Sawyer's leadership on the student council. "This is the only answer I have," Marisol said, "and it's the only one that matters." Nobody in the room said another word. But the moment that cut deepest, the one Marisol would carry folded up tight in her chest for years, came when Wren was 15. Marisol had driven to the high school to pick her up from soccer practice, waiting in the parking lot the way she always did, leaning against her old station wagon with a thermos of coffee. When Wren came out with a knot of teammates, one of the girls pointed toward the car and asked who that was. Wren glanced at her mother, then back at her friend and said, quick and light, tossing the words away without checking where they'd land, "Oh, that's just our housekeeper." Sawyer heard about it that same night from a friend on the team. He confronted his sister in the kitchen, his voice sharp in a way it rarely was. "She's our mother, Wren." Our mother. How could you say that? Ren's face crumpled. You don't get it. You're a boy. Nobody whispers about you at school. Nobody asks you every single day why your mom looks nothing like you. Marisol was in the hallway. She heard every word of it. She didn't step in. She walked out to the back porch, sat down in the old wicker chair that had been her father's, and stayed there for hours watching the fog roll in off the harbor. It was the only time in 20 years of raising those children that she let herself wonder whether her love had become something they'd have to carry instead of something that made them lighter. 2 days later, Ren found her in the diner's storeroom, restocking napkins that didn't need restocking. She stood in the doorway a long time before she spoke. I'm sorry, Mom. I was scared. But I was wrong to say it. Marisol set down the box. You're not wrong for being scared, Mija. You're only wrong if you let the fear pick your words for you. Ren nodded, crossed the room and hugged her hard, the way she used to when she was 5 years old, and the whole world was a rainy diner window and a woman who hadn't walked away. There were good years, too, plenty of them. The Christmas Sawyer was 12 and Ren was 10. The diner's water heater died and ate every spare dollar Marisol had, so there was nothing left for presents. She stayed up until 2 in the mornings on Christmas Eve refinishing an old rowboat oar into a coat rack for Sawyer and repainting Ren's outgrown bicycle a shade of teal that almost passed for new. Sawyer understood immediately what the hours meant, more than the gift itself, and he didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her and held on. Ren ran to her room and came back with a drawing done on a blue anchor napkin in crayon. 3 stick figures in front of a small building with a striped awning, one shorter and dark-haired, 2 taller and light, and beneath it in careful, crooked 5-year-old adjacent letters that were actually a 10-year-old's best effort. 2 words, our family. Marisol laminated that napkin at the coffee shop the following week and kept it behind the register for the next 15 years. It would still be there the night she was arrested. Years pass the way years do when you're not looking directly at them. Sawyer went on to law school at the University of Oregon, graduating near the top of his class, and gave a short speech at the commencement dinner where he said that he was standing there because one woman had taught him that showing up wasn't a virtue you got credit for. It was just what love looked like when it had somewhere to be. Marisol wore the only good dress she owned, the navy one from Dale's memorial, and cried in public for the first time since she'd buried an empty casket. Ren, by then, was working as an investigative reporter for a regional paper out of Portland, chasing down stories nobody else wanted to spend the time on. Sawyer took a job with a small civil litigation firm 2 towns over. The 2 children nobody had wanted had become exactly the people Marisol always believed they could be. Not because she'd pushed them, but because she'd never once let go. And then the call came. It was a Tuesday night in early spring when everything broke apart. Roland Pike, the quality control manager at Callaway Seafood Processing, the largest employer in Gull Harbor, the company whose name sat on the plaque above the elementary school gym, the company that had employed Marisol part-time doing the night bookkeeping since the diner's slow seasons didn't cover the property taxes anymore, was found dead in the plant's freezer bay. Blunt force trauma. The county sheriff classified it as a homicide within hours. Within 48 of those hours, Marisol Reyes was in handcuffs. The case against her rested on 3 legs, and every one of them wobbled if you looked closely enough, though nobody in the sheriff's department seemed inclined to look. First, her employee badge showed she was the last person to swipe out of the plant that night. Second, she and Roland Pike had clashed publicly 3 weeks earlier, after Marisol discovered discrepancies in the cold storage logs. Expired product being relabeled and shipped anyway, and reported it directly to plant ownership, a move that made her no friends and at least one very determined enemy. Third, a night security guard named Dale Whitcomb, no relation to her late husband, a coincidence the sheriff's office never quite let go of. Claimed he'd seen her near the freezer bay around the time Pike was killed. That was the entire case. No forensics, no weapon, no footage. A badge swipe, an argument on record, and one man's word. Marisol told the detectives the truth. She'd clocked out, walked to her car, remembered she'd left her reading glasses on the office desk, and gone back inside for 2 minutes. She never went near the freezer bay. She never saw Roland Pike that night. But in Gull Harbor, truth had a way of bending around a woman who looked like Marisol Reyes. Close enough to see, never quite close enough to touch. The public defender assigned to her case, a young man with a caseload he clearly resented, met with her once in the county lockup and laid it out plainly. "They're pushing for first degree, ma'am. Life without parole. My advice, and I mean this as advice, not pressure, take the plea. Manslaughter. You'd be looking at 15 years instead of the rest of your life." "I didn't kill anyone," Marisol said. "I hear you. But this county, this jury pool, the math isn't kind to you. I have spent 20 years teaching my children that the truth is worth more than being comfortable," Marisol said. "I am not going to stand up in a courtroom and say I did something I didn't do. Not for 15 years, not for 15 minutes. The public defender withdrew from the case 4 days before trial, citing a scheduling conflict that fooled no one. Marisol was left without an attorney and a trial date that would not move. The news reached Wren first. Their old pastor called her newsroom on a Wednesday afternoon. "Wren, I'm sorry to have to tell you this over the phone. Your mother's been arrested. They're saying she killed a man at the plant." Wren was 3 weeks into the biggest investigation of her career, a piece on state pensions mismanagement she'd spent 4 months building. She left it open on her desk without a second thought and was on the highway south within the hour. Sawyer got the news that same evening, deep in preparation for a case he'd spent half a year's assembling. But when he pulled the county's filing and read through the state's evidence, the lawyer in him saw immediately what the son in him had already known before he finished the first page. The whole case rested on circumstance and a single eyewitness, nothing that would survive real scrutiny in front of a fair jury. He called Wren. "This has more holes than a case file should be allowed to have. Somebody wanted Mom to take the fall for this." "I know," Wren said, already merging onto the highway. "I'm driving." Sawyer understood exactly what it would cost him to represent his own mother in a murder trial. The prosecution would call him compromised, emotional, unreliable. But he also understood something else. No attorney in Gull Harbor was going to fight with everything they had for a woman the Calloway family had already decided was guilty in a town where the Calloway name paid half the mortgages. If Marisol was going to get a real defense, it would have to come from the two people who knew, without a shadow of doubt, exactly who she was. They met at a gas station roughly halfway between Portland and Gull Harbor. Two grown adults who had once been two soaked children standing under a diner awning, and they made their decision without needing many words between them. They were going back to the town that had spent 20 years quietly doubting their family, and this time they were going to stand in its courtroom and make it answer for that doubt. The trial of Marisol Reyes opened on a Monday morning in the Coos County Courthouse, and from the first hour the room felt like a verdict that had already been decided and was simply waiting for the formalities to catch up. Sawyer took his seat at the defense table beside his mother. He'd filed the proper motions, submitted his credentials, been formally approved as counsel. But none of that stopped the ripple of whispers through the gallery when the jury saw a young man with his mother's same steady eyes sit down and rest a hand briefly on her shoulder before the bailiff called the room to order. The district attorney leading the prosecution was a man named Warren Truitt, methodical, unshowy, the kind of prosecutor who could make circumstantial evidence sound like scripture just by choosing his words in the right order. Jury selection had already told Sawyer most of what he needed to know. 11 white jurors, 1 Latino juror. He challenged the composition. Judge Alvin Kestrel, a Coos County native who'd sat that bench for 18 years, denied it without much explanation. Sawyer noted the objection for the record and moved on because noting it was the only power he had over it that morning. Truett's opening was a master class in implication he never had to say aloud. He talked about the badge swipe. He talked about the argument 3 weeks prior. He talked about opportunity. A woman alone in a plant at night. He never mentioned anything about who Marisol was beyond that, and the omission did all the work he needed it to do. Sawyer stood for his opening and went the opposite direction entirely. No theatrics, just one question repeated. "Where is the evidence?" he asked, looking at each juror in turn. "Not the assumptions. The proof. They have a badge that shows a woman went to work that night. They have an argument from 3 weeks earlier. And they have one witness whose account I am going to ask you to examine very carefully. That is not a case, ladies and gentlemen. That is a story with the gaps left in on purpose. And in this country, we don't convict people to fill in gaps." A few jurors shifted. Truett's jaw tightened by a fraction, but it was early, and opening statements were promises the verdict would eventually have to answer for. The state called Dale Whitcomb as its key witness on the second day. He walked to the stand with the stiff posture of a man who had rehearsed his own testimony one too many times. His story was simple. At roughly 10:40 that night, he'd seen Marisol Reyes walking toward the freezer bay from his post at the front security gate. He knew her walk, he said. He was certain. Sawyer let the words settle in the room before he stood, carrying a single printed layout of the Callaway plant grounds. "Mr. Whitcomb, where exactly were you standing when you say you saw my mother?" "At the front gate booth." Sawyer held up the map so the jury could see it. "The front gate is here. The freezer bay entrance is here, nearly 200 yards away, on the far side of 2 processing buildings. There is no direct line of sight between those 2 points." He turned back to the witness. "You're telling this court you identified a specific individual at night from 200 yards through 2 buildings by her walk." Whitcomb's certainty cracked a little at the edges. "I've worked with her for years. I know how she moves." "How she moves," Sawyer repeated slowly. "At night." Through walls, he let the jury sit with it. "Mr. Whitcomb, isn't it true that 1 week after Roland Pike's death you were promoted to head of plant security?" Whitcomb blinked. "That was a routine promotion." "Who signed the order?" A pause. His eyes flicked toward the prosecution table before he answered. "Bennett Callaway." "The plant's vice president of operations," Sawyer said. "The same Bennett Callaway who oversees every personnel decision at that facility." He didn't ask another question. He simply said, "Nothing further," and sat down. It was a small seed, and the jury might not have noticed it take root yet. But seeds rarely need to be noticed to grow. While Sawyer fought inside the courtroom, Wren worked outside it. She'd taken indefinite leave from her paper, though leave was a generous word for what amounted to walking away from her pension mid-story. She didn't care. Stories could wait. Her mother couldn't. Wren started where investigative reporters always start, with the money. She pulled public financial filings for Callaway Seafood, cross-referenced shipping manifests against actual inventory logs, and began quietly working her way through current and former employees willing to talk off the record. What she found went well beyond one dead quality manager. Roland Pike hadn't just been cutting corners on cold storage. He and Bennett Callaway had been running a years-long scheme relabeling expired and substandard product, shipping it out under falsified inspection dates, and pocketing the difference between what the plant claimed to spend on quality control and what it actually did. The scheme had drained the company for at least 4 years, while genuinely unsafe product went out under a clean label. Marisol had stumbled onto the edge of it without knowing how deep it went. As night bookkeeper, she'd noticed the cold storage numbers not matching the shipping logs, brought it to Roland Pike first, and been brushed off. So she'd gone over his head, straight to ownership, which meant her complaint landed on Bennett Calloway's desk, the very man profiting from the fraud. 3 weeks before Pike's death, Marisol had gone one step further and emailed the State Department of Agriculture requesting a surprise inspection. If that inspection had gone through, the whole scheme would have collapsed, and both Pike and Calloway would have been facing federal charges. Wren called Sawyer from her motel room past midnight, her voice tight with the controlled urgency of someone holding a live wire. This wasn't random. Bennett Calloway and Roland Pike were stealing from their own company for years. Mom found out and reported it. She emailed the state 3 weeks before Pike died. If that inspection had gone through, Calloway was finished. Sawyer was quiet on the other end, thinking it through. Someone needed the fraud trail buried before the inspectors showed up. Wren continued, and they needed someone to blame. Someone who already had a documented argument with Pike. Someone the town would believe without asking too many questions. And she was that person, Sawyer said, finishing the thought, because of who she is in this town. The picture was coming into focus, but having a theory and proving it in court were two very different things, and the gap between them was about to become painfully clear. Bennett Calloway hadn't built the kind of power he had by being careless. Within days of Wren's inquiries, the pressure started. 2 former plant employees who'd agreed to talk suddenly stopped returning her calls. One of them phoned her back from a blocked number, just long enough to whisper, "I've got a family, I can't be part of this," before the line went dead. Then Wren's editor in Portland called, his voice carrying a tone she'd never heard from him before. Careful, rehearsed, the sound of a man delivering someone else's message. "Wren, you're on leave. You are not authorized to conduct investigative work on the paper's behalf right now. If we find out you're using your press credentials to interfere with an active criminal proceeding, we're going to have to review your employment." Wren understood exactly what that meant. Somebody with influence had made a phone call. Inside the courtroom, Truitt shifted tactics the moment he felt the case softening at the edges, attacking the defense's credibility instead of shoring up his own evidence. "I want to draw the jury's attention," he said during a motions hearing, "to an unusual feature of this case. Defense counsel is not a neutral advocate. He is the defendant's son. Every objection, every argument he makes here is shaped by personal loyalty, not by the facts. It put Sawyer in an impossible position. Respond too forcefully, and he proved the point. Stay too clinical, and he lost the one advantage he actually had, the jury seeing, plainly, what it looked like when someone knew a person's character down to the bone." He chose his words carefully. "The prosecution suggests my relationship to my client compromises my judgment. I'd suggest the opposite. I know this woman. I know exactly what she is and isn't capable of. Personal knowledge of a person's character isn't a weakness in this room. It's precisely what this jury needs." It was a strong answer, but Sawyer could feel the ground shifting under him regardless, and he wasn't certain which way it was tilting. The weight fell heaviest on Marisol. Stripped of the diner, the routine, everything that had given her days their shape for 20 years, she began folding inward in the county lockup. She barely touched her meals. During visitation, separated from Sawyer by a scarred plexiglass divider, he saw something in her eyes he had never seen there before. Not fear, not anger, but a quiet exhaustion that looked uncomfortably close to giving up. "I want you and your sister to stop," Marisol said, her voice steady but heavy. "I won't have you two burning down your careers over this." Sawyer pressed his hand flat against the glass. "You didn't quit when this whole town said you had no business raising us. You didn't quit when Diane Calloway humiliated you at that meeting in front of everyone. You didn't quit the night Wren called you the housekeeper. And you sat out on that porch alone till morning and still showed up the next day like nothing had happened. so don't ask me to quit now." On the other side of the glass, Marisol looked at his hand pressed there and raised her own to meet it, their palms separated by an inch of scratched plastic and 20 years of everything they'd carried together. That night, in the parking lot of a roadside motel, Wren and Sawyer had the hardest disagreement of their lives. Wren wanted to publish everything immediately: the financial records, the fraud, the timeline connecting Bennett Calloway to the cover-up, and force the story into daylight where public pressure could do what the courtroom wasn't doing. "If I run this tomorrow, every outlet in the state picks it up by noon. The judge can't ignore it. If you publish before I get it in front of the jury," Sawyer said, "Truett files for a mistrial and wins it. The judge grants it, and Mom sits in that cell for another year waiting on a new trial. She won't survive that, Wren. Not the waiting. And if I let you handle it and the judge shuts you down anyway, what then? At least the public would know. I'm her lawyer. I need you to trust that." Wren stared at the cracked asphalt for a long moment, eyes wet, voice steady when she finally spoke. "I do trust you, but I also remember sitting in that hallway hearing her out on that porch the night I was too ashamed to call her my mother in front of my friends. I am not going to let anyone make her sit alone again." They struck a deal. Sawyer would file a motion to introduce the fraud evidence. If the judge accepted it, they'd fight from inside the system. If he refused, Wren would publish within the hour. Judge Kestrel read the motion in chambers for the better part of an hour and came back to the bench with his face giving away nothing. The motion to introduce supplementary financial evidence is denied. The material concerns corporate irregularities outside the scope of a murder trial and does not meet the exculpatory standard required at this stage. The ruling landed on Sawyer like a physical weight. He knew the judge wasn't entirely wrong on the technical point of law, and he also knew that without it, all he had left was the weakness of the state's case. And in a courtroom where the defendant looked like Marisol Reyes, weakness of evidence hadn't always been enough to save anyone in that county's history. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and came back deadlocked. Judge Kestrel sent them to resume the next morning, warning that a mistrial was on the table if they remained stuck. A mistrial meant Truett could refile. It meant months, maybe a year, before any of this started over. That evening, guards led Marisol back to her cell. In the quiet, she reached into the small case of personal items she was allowed to keep and pulled out a laminated diner napkin, worn soft at the folded edges from 20 years of being carried. 3 stick figures in front of a building with a striped awning. 2 words in a 10-year-old's careful crayon hand. "Our family." She held it under the weak light leaking through the bars and traced the lines with her fingertip until the cell went as quiet as a room built for punishment can ever be. Outside, in a motel room a few miles away, Wren wasn't sleeping. She was staring at the ceiling and making a decision no journalism class had prepared her for. The legal road had narrowed almost to nothing, but she wasn't only a reporter. She was the daughter of a woman who had taught her, by word and by example, that you don't wait for someone else to do the right thing. You do it yourself, especially when it costs you. She scrolled to a name she'd found buried in old plant employment records 3 days earlier and hadn't known what to do with until now. Opal Fenwick, former administrative assistant at Callaway Seafood, 17 years with the company, quietly pushed into early retirement 2 months after Roland Pike's death. Wren drove to Opal Fenwick's house at 11 that night. A small bungalow at the edge of town, porch light off, curtains drawn, everything about it saying "go away." She knocked anyway. "Mrs. Fenwick, my name is Wren Kessler. I know you worked at that plant for 17 years, and I know you were pushed out right after Roland Pike died. I'm not here as a reporter tonight. I'm here as a daughter. My mother is sitting in a jail cell for something she didn't do, and I think you might know something that could help her." The house stayed dark for a long, unbearable moment. Then the deadbolt turned. Opal Fenwick was in her 60s, gray-haired, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. And she studied Wren's face the way people study something they've been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Whatever she saw, there was enough. She stepped aside and let her in. What she told her changed everything. On the night Pike died, Opal had gone back to the plant after hours to collect personal files from her desk before they disappeared, since she already sensed her job was ending. Walking the back corridor near the freezer bay, she'd seen Bennett Calloway coming from that direction, his shirt disheveled, his hands visibly shaking. When he spotted her, he'd stopped cold. "You were never here tonight," he'd told her. Not a request. A command. 2 days later, her early retirement notice arrived, her pension tied to a company plan Bennett Calloway controlled. The message hadn't needed to be spoken twice. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Wren asked. Opal looked at her folded hands. "Because in this town, when a Calloway tells you to be quiet, you stay quiet. That's how it's always worked here." "It doesn't have to work that way tomorrow," Wren said. Opal Fenwick looked up at this young woman who had driven hours, walked away from her own career, and knocked on a stranger's door past 11 at night to save a mother who didn't look a thing like her, but was her mother in every way that mattered. And she understood, finally, something she'd spent months avoiding. Silence hadn't been safety, it had been complicity. She agreed to testify. The next morning, Sawyer filed an emergency motion to call a new witness before deliberations resumed. Truitt was on his feet immediately, objecting with a fury that rattled the courtroom's old windows. "This is a stalling tactic, Your Honor." The defense had every opportunity during trial to present witnesses. Sawyer stood his ground, citing Brady v. Maryland and the state's obligation to allow exculpatory testimony to reach a jury. "This witness was at the scene the night of the murder, Your Honor. She has first-hand knowledge of another individual's movements at the exact time in question. If this court blocks that testimony, any verdict returned here will not survive an appeal." Judge Kestrel weighed his instinct to keep control of his courtroom against his awareness that an appellate panel would look very unkindly on a judge who'd blocked eyewitness testimony in a murder trial. "The motion is granted," he said at last. "The witness will be heard." Opal Fenwick took the stand in a courtroom gone so quiet every footstep echoed off the walls. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She told the truth the way a woman who'd spent 17 years keeping careful records tells you exactly what she saw and when she saw it, the disheveled shirt, the shaking hands, the exact words. "You were never here tonight," and she explained, without excuses, why she'd stayed silent for as long as she had. Truitt cross-examined her hard. "Why should this jury believe an account you sat on for months? Isn't it possible this is resentment talking? From a woman. Let go by the company that employed her?" Opal turned from the prosecutor and looked straight at the jury. "I stayed quiet because I was scared. Because that's what people learn to do in this town. I'm not proud of it. But I'm here now because I watched an innocent woman get charged with something she didn't do, and my silence was helping make that happen." When Truitt sat down, something in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single crack of thunder, but the way pressure changes in the air before a storm finally breaks. Sawyer rose for his closing without theater, speaking the way his mother had always spoken to him. Plainly, like the truth didn't need decoration to hold weight. "My mother spent 20 years raising 2 children the world told her weren't hers to raise. She never asked what she'd get back for it. And when she found out her employer was cutting corners that put people's safety at risk, she didn't stay quiet, because staying quiet has never been who she is. That cost her. Not because of evidence, not because of proof, because she was convenient, because a powerful man needed someone to blame, and a Mexican woman running a diner in a town that has never quite known what to do with women like her was the easiest target available. You've heard a badge swipe that proves nothing except that she went to work that night. You've heard a witness whose testimony can't survive basic geometry. And now you've heard a woman who watched, with her own eyes, another man leave that scene, a man with motive, opportunity, and the power to keep an entire town quiet. Justice doesn't arrive because you wait for it. It arrives because somebody builds it. Today, that's you. He sat back down beside his mother. She looked at him not with hope and not with fear, but with the expression of someone watching something she'd built finally stand up entirely on its own. The jury deliberated for 51 minutes. When the foreperson rose, an older man who had sat through every single day of the trial without giving away a single thing on his face, he unfolded one sheet of paper. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty. Marisol didn't move. She sat perfectly still, eyes closed, hands flat on the table in front of her. Sawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture from the first day of trial, except this time neither of them let go. Wren came from the gallery and wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a long moment the three of them stood together in the middle of a courtroom that had spent weeks trying to take them apart. Marisol opened her eyes, looked at her children, both of them crying, both of them stronger than she had ever quite let herself believe, and said the first thing that came to her. "You two really did grow up fine, huh?" Wren laughed through her tears, and the sound filled that courtroom completely, without apology, the way laughter does when it finally has room to. In the weeks after, Wren's investigation ran across 3 regional outlets and got picked up nationally within days. Federal investigators opened a case into Callaway Seafood Processing. Bennett Callaway was indicted on fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy charges. Dale Whitcomb pleaded guilty to perjury in exchange for a reduced sentence. Marisol went home. The blue anchor was a little more weathered than it had been, the paint on the sign a little more faded, but it opened again the following Monday at 5 in the morning, same as always. The laminated napkin went back behind the register, where it had sat for 15 years, the crayon lines still bright enough to read. 3 figures, 1 building, 1 word that no courtroom and no town's quiet doubt had ever managed to take from them. On a clear evening not long after, Marisol sat out on the back porch and watched the fog roll in off the harbor the way she had 1,000 times before. Wren sat on the steps beside her. Sawyer leaned against the railing. Nobody said much for a while. Some things don't need words, they just need someone there. When Marisol finally broke the quiet, she said something neither of her children expected. "People used to ask me why I took you two in. I never had a good answer for it. I think I finally do." They both looked at her. "I didn't do it because you needed me," she said. "I did it because I needed you a whole lot more than either of you ever needed me." Wren shook her head, smiling. "Mom, that might be the most ridiculous and truest thing you've ever said." 20 years earlier, a woman had chosen to love 2 children the world told her weren't hers to love. She asked for nothing back. She never expected anything back. She simply showed up, day after day, and built something that half the town said couldn't possibly hold together. A family that didn't match, in a place that never quite approved, kept whole by nothing fancier than the stubborn conviction that love doesn't need anybody's permission, and that the truth is worth defending even when it costs you everything you have. And in the end, the thing she built turned out to be the only thing strong enough to save her. Not the law, not the system, not the town that had spent 2 decades watching her carry that weight and never once offered to help carry it with her. Her children, the ones nobody else had wanted, saved her the exact same way she had once saved them. Not with anything grand, just with the plain, stubborn refusal to let go. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with when the story's over. Not the courtroom, not the verdict, not even the years of quiet unfairness that came before it. Somewhere out there tonight, somebody is deciding to love a person the world has told them isn't theirs to love. And that decision, small and unremarkable as it might look from the outside right now, could turn out to be the very thing that saves them both, 20 years down the road, when nobody's expecting it.